You know, it's easy to think of history as one thing just ending and a new thing starting, but it's almost never that clean. Today, we're diving deep into the world of ancient Arabia to see how the Quranic message didn't just show up and replace everything, it actually engaged with the world it found, it challenged it, and in the end, it completely reformed it.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to explore the religious world that was already there. Then we'll look at the message of reform itself. We'll break down what changed versus what stayed, check out the actual archaeological proof, and finally, see how this all created a brand new social and psychological reality.
And this is really the big question that's going to guide us through this whole journey. The answer isn't a simple yes or no. The reality, when you start looking at the history and the archaeology, is so much more interesting. We're going to move past the easy answers and see what the evidence actually tells us.
Okay, so to really understand a reform, you first have to get a picture of what was being reformed. In ancient Arabia, well, it was anything but a monolith. Think of it more like a sprawling, vibrant mosaic of different beliefs, each one shaped by its own local culture and geography.
So the very first idea we kind of need to set aside is this notion of a single pagan religion. That model just doesn't fit the facts. What was really going on was a whole collection of different local practices, all deeply tied to specific tribes and specific places. There was no pope, no single holy book, no universal theology holding it all together.
Let's start our tour down in the south, in the area of modern-day Yemen. Now, the religion here was a world away from the nomadic life of the central desert. This was the land of big, settled kingdoms like Saba, and their religion was highly organized, almost like what you'd find in ancient Mesopotamia.
In the south, you had these major state gods who were tied to the very survival of their society. A god like Al-Maha, who was in charge of agriculture and irrigation, was absolutely central. You had a formal priesthood, huge temples that were also economic hubs, and a whole pantheon that reflected the concerns of a settled people. The sun, the rain, the harvest.
All right, now let's travel north, up to the lands of the Nabateans, the people famous for that incredible city of Petra. This region was basically a bustling crossroads for empires, Roman, Persian, you name it. And its religion was a reflection of that. It was deeply syncretic, mixing and matching local traditions with foreign ideas.
So the main god up here was Dushara. But what's really fascinating is how he was often identified with the Greek god Zeus or the Roman god Dionysus. It just goes to show you that as caravans moved goods across the desert, they carried ideas with them. A lot of worship also centered on these things called betels, these uncarved stones that were seen as a physical representation of the god. And finally, that brings us to the Hijaz, the region where Mecca and Medina are. Here, the religious vibe was different all over again. It wasn't dominated by big state temples like the South or heavy foreign influence like the North. Mecca was something else. It was more like a ritual marketplace, a central hub for pilgrimage for all the different tribes in the area.
So, inside the famous Kaaba, there was an idol of the god Hubal, but he was joined by this really powerful trio of goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. They were worshipped by tribes all over the region, which really highlights Mecca's role as this shared sacred space where different groups could come and pay respects to their own deities.
So, into this incredibly diverse and honestly pretty fragmented religious world, a new message begins to emerge. And it's so important to understand it not as something totally new, but as a project of radical reform, a systematic effort to reorient every single part of life.
That's the key word right there, reorientation. The Quranic message wasn't trying to just bulldoze every single existing custom. Instead, the goal was to reconfigure the entire landscape, to take existing pieces of the culture and give them a radically new meaning and a new purpose.
And this is a perfect example of that reorientation in action. The name Allah, it wasn't new. Inscriptions show it was already being used for a high god. But the Quran takes that name and completely redefines it. Allah goes from being one God among many, maybe a distant creator, to being the one and only sovereign God, an active personal judge for every human being.
What's amazing is the Qur'an itself actually tells us the logic it was arguing against. It quotes the polytheists as saying, basically, hey, we only worship these other figures to act as intermediaries, to get us closer to the big guy. So the absolute core theological break, the red line, was the total rejection of this practice, which is called shirk, the act of associating any partner or intermediary with the one true God. Okay, so if this was a reform, not a total wipeout, how did that actually work on the ground? What got kept? What got thrown out? And what was transformed so much it became something completely new? Let's break it down.
This reform was smart. It was woven into the fabric of the existing culture. It kept core pilgrimage rituals like walking around the Kaaba. It praised and built upon cherished Arab virtues like hospitality and keeping your word. And it used the most prestigious, beautiful form of language available, the high classical Arabic of the great poets, to deliver its message.
Let's zoom in on the Hajj, because it's the perfect case study. The outward movements, the walking in circles, the running between hills, these would have looked very familiar. But the Quran completely rewired the meaning behind them. What used to be a patchwork of tribal festivals for different gods became a single, universal act of devotion to the one God. The purpose was no longer about honoring idols, it was about showing your personal submission.
But at the same time, let's be clear, there were some hard lines drawn in the sand. The entire system of idols and divine intermediaries was completely rejected. Socially, the endless destructive cycles of tribal revenge were replaced with a system of laws and a huge emphasis on forgiveness. And economically, practices that were seen as unjust, like predatory loans, were flat-out banned.
And this chart just lays it out beautifully. You can see the pattern so clearly. You keep the familiar form, the name of God, the Kaaba sanctuary, the act of pilgrimage, but you completely overhaul the inner meaning. You cleanse it of all the old associations and infuse it with a radical new monotheistic purpose. It's really a masterclass in how to restructure a culture.
Now, a good historian is probably thinking, okay, but how do we know this isn't just a story told centuries later? How can we be sure about the world before Islam? Well, luckily for us, the answer is literally written in stone.
This is just incredible. From the year 528, that's decades before the Prophet Muhammad was even born, we have this rock inscription. It was carved by Arabic-speaking Christians, and it explicitly uses the name Allah for God. This is hard, physical proof that the word Allah wasn't invented, but was already the standard term for the one God among Arab monotheists.
And it's not a one-off find. The Zabad inscription is even older, from 512. It's written in 3 languages, and it lists names that are clearly monotheistic. What this evidence from the stones tells us, loud and clear, is that the Quran didn't just appear in a religious vacuum. It entered a world where monotheism was already a circulating, growing idea within Arabia itself.
But this reform wasn't just about theology. It wasn't just about what you believe. It proposed a change that was arguably even more revolutionary, because it struck right at the foundation of Arabian society, the very definition of who you are.
For centuries, your whole world, your identity, your safety, your loyalty was defined by one thing: your tribe, your bloodline. The Quran comes along and introduces this radical new idea, the Ummah, the community of believers. And in this new model, your identity isn't based on who your cousins are, it's based on what you believe. Your ultimate loyalty shifts from the clan to God and this new universal super tribe.
And the crucial thing is, this wasn't just a nice theory. It was put into practice as a political reality. We actually have a document known as the Constitution of Medina, and it lays out the terms for a brand new political community, an Ummah, made up of both Muslims and Jewish tribes, standing together as one unit separate from the pagan clans. It's the birth of a new kind of state.
This reform also directly attacked the existing economic power structure, especially the one run by the elite in Mecca. The ban on riba, or usury, hit right at the heart of their financial system. The creation of mandatory charity, zakat, forced wealth to be redistributed, and the Quran is constantly criticizing the hoarding of wealth. So this wasn't just spiritual, it was a full-blown socio-economic revolution.
Okay, so finally, if you want to build a new identity, you have to define the one that came before it. The Quranic reform did this by coining a single, powerful term to describe the pre-Islamic past, basically reframing all of history to highlight the change that had occurred.
And that term is Jahiliyyah. Now, you often hear it translated as the age of ignorance, but that doesn't quite capture the full meaning. It wasn't about people being unintelligent. It was a critique of a specific mindset, a kind of hot-headed, arrogant pride, a violent recklessness, and a refusal to bow down to any higher moral authority.
So the goal was a fundamental psychological shift. It was about taking that fiery, wild tribal ego, what the Arabs called khamiyya, and replacing it with Islam, which means a state of submission, a kind of peace that comes from being accountable to God. It was an attempt to rewire the very personality of an entire society.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, what you see is this profound act of reformist restructuring. You have a sharp theological break with the past, sure, but it was achieved through the careful reinterpretation of existing rituals and the preservation of key institutions. The past wasn't erased, it was engaged, remade, and rewired into a totally new worldview.
And this really leaves us with a much bigger, more universal question, doesn't it? The story of 7th century Arabia is this powerful, massive case study of something that every culture, every society has to grapple with. How do we deal with our own past? How do we decide which traditions we carry forward, which ones we reform, and which ones we decide to leave behind for good?
It's a really fascinating way to look at how history unfolds. If you've ever noticed any of these patterns of reform and reinterpretation in other cultures, I'd love to read about it in the comments. We'll be breaking down more topics just like this. Thanks for joining this deep dive.